And at this time on a Tuesday, we do like to check in with Greg Bondar from Christian Voice Australia. He's National Director. Of course, Christian Voice Australia, a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg Bondar, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, good morning, Neil.
Greg, sometimes we think religion and politics, how do they mix? Some are convinced they shouldn't mix at all. Others are on this trajectory of getting things right, and now we've got an example of someone who is solidly a Christian and in a very high-profile role, talking about the United States Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. You've been looking into the way he juggles politics and faith.
Yeah, that's correct, Neil. What brought this to my attention was a recent article in the New York Times, which is a very left-wing woke type newspaper that supports, same-sex marriage, abortion, and the whole lot. And they wrote a fairly scathing report about the Speaker of the House, Johnson, and I just feel that it's interesting that once you get a Christian into politics, that they are open for attack. And recently I was at a church where I was speaking, and the same view was being held that, church and politics don't mix. But, Neil, I just want to make the point that while many pastors and ministers promote the separation of church and state, Neil, they seem to forget that our founding fathers in our Constitution sought to protect the church from an encroaching state against against an encroaching state rather than the other way around. And I think we need to bear that in mind, that was the purpose of the Constitution, the Australian Constitution, so that I don't see a difference between church and politics. I think they're very intertwined.
Yes, it's one of those things. I think it's been a confusing thing for some people when they think that the separation of church and state is about protecting the state from the church. Actually, it is the opposite way around, the protection of the church from the encroachment of the state. And of course, we're seeing that substantially happening in so many different dimensions. Hey, let's come back to this guy, Mike Johnson.
Yeah.
How do you think he's doing it well?
Look, I think we have a Christian, a self-confessed Christian, is a Southern Baptist, and what he's doing is he's allowing, and it's obvious that he's allowing his politics to be shaped by his faith, and I think that's rightly so. I mean, you've got to make sure that you're not preaching whilst you're in a position of a political power. But what he's doing is he's not shying away from the fact that he is a Christian, he's a Southern Baptist, and he's making sure that his politics is reflected through his faith. And I think that's very important, whereas a lot of our politicians tend to sort of shy away from doing that now.
And examples with him, where can we settle on something here? And it's interesting that his colleagues in the Republican Party all must have been weighing up what's good and what's not about him, and they decided this guy is the man for the job to be Speaker of the House. What sort of policies does he stand out for that he's settled on holding tight to?
Yeah, Neil, look, let's make it perfectly clear that, as I said, he's a Christian Southern Baptist. He held the role of president some time ago as well. The point is that he is a pro-life, he's against abortion, he's against same-sex marriage, because he's trying to stand on the principle of a biblical worldview, and which means really, Neil, that, he has to make sure that his biblical faith is reflected in how he manages his role as Speaker of the House. And I think that's to be commended, because a lot of our politicians, tend to say that, oh, you can't do that. Well, I'm afraid if you're a Christian, I don't want to get to the stage where I'm in heaven and I'm told, Greg, why didn't you confess your faith at the time? Blah blah blah. So I think it's important that we take note of that.
And there's contrast, isn't there, to the American Republican Party right now, who we'd say are the Conservatives, and our Conservatives here in Australia, because right now, I mean, I can think of a few pro-life politicians, but really they're hard to find, and really there's not more than a handful. But really, in some sense here, Greg, there needs to be whole party policy that's pro-life. That's just not the case. I can't think of anywhere in Australia. Can you?
No, look, I can't, Neil, and again, I make the point that that Christian principles need to be upheld. And one of the things that people do is they tend to compromise, Neil, as politicians. They might be Christians, on a Sunday, but when it comes to their political role at the New South Wales Parliament or Queensland Parliament or federal Parliament, Neil, they tend to shy away from reflecting their faith. And I think that's a shame because, they would do so much better to say, I am a Christian and here's what I stand for. So, I urge all politicians to not shy away from it and live by their biblical worldview.
I guess we might even be suspicious that until there is some form of majority that will stand for some biblical values, we're going to continue a trajectory in the wrong direction, and things are going to be unwound and unravelled, and serious things are ahead. Any predictions from you about what 2024 might hold? Are we in for a whole lot of difficult times with the status of our politicians?
Look, I'm afraid so, Neil. I think that secularism and secular aggression is going to grow. Religious faith will be under attack. It's going to be an ongoing cultural war. I think some of the good things, I guess, is that your Premier has resigned and now I'm coming to Queensland now that she's gone. I'll be coming to holidays there because, you see, Neil, I've just been through a whole history of the legislation she has put through. And I'll tell you what, it's a blastedly bad legacy that she's leaving behind for the Christian person. So, let's make sure that, we continue to fight the good fight and we continue to, defend our faith in the public square.
Well, there's certainly not a lot of accolades from the Christian view of an Anastasia Palaszczuk, and Christians that I've spoken to are happy to see her gone. But there's still a little bit of an unknown quantity about who will take her place, and there's some suggestion it might even be worse. Hey, let's talk marriage. Let's talk marriage. Marriage decline. You've been looking at some statistics. What have you found?
Now, this is really disturbing. I've been looking at my own family, but I came across some data that almost 90% of the world's population now live in countries with falling marriage rates. Now, that is really distressing, and I think we as Christians, if we tend to live by the flourishing Christian view of marriage, then we need to be aware that, in the US alone, Neil, marriage rates have decreased by 60% since 1970. And in Australia, even more so, the number of marriages registered in 2019 were about 113,000 and was lower than in 1970, where it was 116,000. So, we are really falling behind in terms of ensuring that, the biblical view of a family is a husband and a wife, and it is through marriage that they continue to flourish. And it's a real problem and something we should be all aware of as we look at our grandchildren, our children, and of course society at large.
And certainly worthy of pausing and reflecting on that, because, as you say, the number of marriages registered in 2019 even lower than in 1970. And if you were doing some sums there on what that means by way of our population growth, in the last 50 years, our population has grown substantially. And that is really disturbing, that there are less registered marriages now than there was 50 years ago. That's something that actually ought to capture your attention.
Oh, absolutely. And here's some other data that I came across. Did you know, Neil, that according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 30% of marriages in Australia end in divorce. Now, that's a real shame because I've now also looked at data that tells you that cohabitation before marriage, back in, I think, 1975, 16% of people confessed to cohabitating before marriage. Neil, guess what it is in 2017? 81% of people cohabited before marriage. Now, that's a real shame because that sets the wrong tone for the family, for the children that there are. And I think we've got to make sure that we understand that marriage is biblical. It's a mum and dad, and it's the best thing for the child. And these data really, really reflect a very, very poor societal view of our marriage here in Australia.
And is it showing us, Greg, that ordinary Australians, and by majority, don't even see marriage as being a positive for having a family? So it's a better thing just to say I'm a parent than it is to say that I'm a married parent.
Correct. Now, I looked at some data again, and a lot of people were saying, well, marriage is an important parenting is. In other words, they're saying that I'm a parent. Now, for example, a same-sex couple might say I'm a parent of a child. I don't know how they had the child apart from adoption or other means, but the point I'm making there is that they are seeing parenting as being far more important than the family. Well, that's wrong, Neil. Parenting does not give you the same development of the child as the family does in terms of a mother and a father. Now, I did Masters of Education when I was at university, and I looked at the development of the child, and you know what, Neil? The father and mother still have the greatest impact on the child from a family point of view, and I think that's being lost with this parenting preference over marriage and the family, Neil.
So when we think of what it takes to be successful in a marriage and raising children in a family, it's still going to be the get married and have a commitment for a lifelong relationship so that you sow your lives into the welfare of those children, rather than do something outside of that and perhaps on a whim. Just, it took us by surprise that this happened, and all of a sudden you're into marriage, or all of a sudden you're into family, but without the commitment of a marriage. So those sorts of things, they go together.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. And, what worries me is, and I call it the left because, the secular, anti-Christian, anti-biblical view is that, parenting is okay, you can be a same-sex couple. But, Neil, you can't have two fathers or you can't have two mothers or wives. It just doesn't work. It's not natural. And it will reflect on the child's development in the years to come. You see, one of the problems we've got is that marriage has declined, because what have you got now? Parenting rather than marriage. You've got same-sex marriage rather than natural marriage. Neil, it's a real issue, and I'm not surprised that the data is indicating that marriages continue to decline, and we've got to reverse that, both from a family point of view and also from our own church. We've got to start preaching the biblical view of marriage now.
Okay, another issue just to quickly pick up on here, Greg, Christians and our role in the fight against anti-Semitism. One thing to be able to watch all of those protests and anti-Semitic demonstrations on television, and we wonder about what we're supposed to be doing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Neil, I'm really disturbed by this. I mean, my brother actually married a Jewish girl, Neil. So my nieces both are Jewish. As you know, anyone born to a Jewish mother is Jewish by birth. And they live in what we call the eastern suburbs here in Sydney, Neil. And I've heard some horrific stories of persecution, of abuse, of bullying, of all sorts of Jewish people that are just walking along the street. Now, anti-Semitism has to stop, Neil. We do not want to go back to World War II type situations. So what I'm saying, Neil, here is that, what is the role of the Christian? I think there's a real responsibility for Christians to fight anti-Semitism. And I'm talking from a biblical perspective, Neil, because, we need to awaken the sleeping giant of Christianity with biblical messages of support for Israel now.
It's one thing, isn't it, to be a Christian and to be silent, but then to decide that I'm going to speak up, because clearly our governments are not acting the way we'd like them to. They're not shutting down the demonstrations. Police are standing by and watching these things happen on our streets. So somehow or other we've got to be able to reevaluate where we all stand in that mix.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I've been talking to a very close colleague of mine, the president of the Australian Jewish Association, and the horrific stories that I hear and read that they tell me. And I started to think, what is the role of the Christian? Well, quite frankly, the Bible tells us, Neil, that we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Psalm 112, verse 6. So let's look at it from a biblical perspective. But not only that, you and I both know, Neil, that Israel has a special meaning for God. And I think we as Christians, so we need to be aware of that. And on top of that, if you look at the history of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian heritage is the foundation. And they are both being persecuted for different reasons. So now, as a Christian, we need to get out there. We need to make sure that we defend Israel, and more importantly, stand up against anti-Semitism, because we are Christians and we need to ensure that we do our bit from a biblical perspective.
Well, the Jewish people don't have many friends around the world, and there might be all sorts of reasons for that. Some of that is a religious reason, and Christians are their friends, and we need to be ready to stand up wherever we can to defend the nation of Israel and their right to existence. Greg Bondar is National Director of Christian Voice Australia, a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. To connect with Greg, you can go to the website christianvoiceaustralia.blog. christianvoiceaustralia.blog. Greg, always appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for those today on 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil, and blessings to all the people who've tuned into our discussions over the years. So blessings to you and to your listeners.